The job seemed simple enough. Watch over a luxurious mansion deep in the woods for a week while the owner was away. Mark, a struggling college student, couldn't believe his luck when he landed the gig. The pay was ridiculously good, and all he had to do was keep an eye on things, water a few plants, and make sure the alarm system stayed active. It was the easiest money he'd ever make. The house itself was massive, cold, modern, and drowning in silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, offering a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. Though something about the sheer openness of the glass unsettled him. It felt like he was on display. Still, he brushed off the unease, chalking it up to nerves. The first night was quiet. Mark roamed the house, checking the security system like the owner had instructed. Everything seemed fine. He locked the doors, turned off the lights, and settled into the massive king-size bed in the guest room. But something woke him in the middle of the night. A sensation, deep, primal, the feeling of being watched. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The room was dark, but moonlight streamed in through the giant windows. His gaze flickered toward the forest outside, expecting to see an animal. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. There was a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out any details, but the silhouette was human-shaped, unmoving. Mark blinked, his pulse quickening. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just watched. A trick of the shadows, maybe? He reached for his phone and opened the security camera app. The live feed showed the exterior of the house, clear and crisp. No one was there. He exhaled a shaky breath, glanced back outside. The figure was gone. The next morning, Mark tried to shake the eerie feeling, convincing himself he was just seeing things. He busied himself with small tasks around the house, pushing the previous night's events to the back of his mind. That night, the unease returned. As he lay in bed, the sensation of unseen eyes crept over him again. This time, he checked the cameras first. He scanned through each feed, each angle of the property. Nothing. Everything still as it had been before. Then, he switched to the camera facing the living room. His stomach dropped. Something was inside the house. A shadow stood near the glass doors, barely distinguishable in the dim lighting. Mark froze, his breathing shallow. He blinked, and when his eyes refocused, the shadow was gone. His fingers trembled as he switched to another camera. The hallway, nothing. The kitchen, empty. He flipped through every angle, but the figure had disappeared. Mark grabbed a flashlight and forced himself to investigate. His footsteps echoed unnervingly through the house as he searched every room, checking every locked door. Nothing was out of place. But as he returned to his room, he felt it again, that thick, suffocating feeling of being observed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, his own reflection in the massive bedroom window. But something was wrong. His reflection was smiling. Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding. He wasn't smiling. His face was frozen in terror. But his reflection, it grinned wide and unnatural. The corners of its mouth stretched too far, and then it moved. Not as a reflection should, but independently. The mark in the window took a step forward, closing the gap between. Mark turned to run, but his legs refused to move. His reflection raised a hand and knocked on the glass from inside. The sound sent ice through Mark's veins. His own voice, distorted, wrong, whispered from the reflection, "Let me in." The lights flickered. The room grew suffocatingly cold. The reflection pressed its face against the glass, eyes dark and empty. Mark bolted. He ran out of the room, down the stairs, straight for the front door. He fumbled with the locks, his breath ragged, hands shaking. He needed to get out. He needed to... A whisper tickled the back of his neck. "You already did." The lights went out, and Mark screamed. Samantha had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, whispers of haunted houses, none of it ever fazed her. So when her coworker Julia asked her to house sit for a week, she didn't hesitate. The pay was decent, and all she had to do was keep an eye on things while Julia was away visiting family. The house was in an old neighborhood, a quiet street lined with towering oak trees. It had character, antique furniture, creaky wooden floors, and a musty smell that came with age. The first night passed without incident. Samantha locked the doors, set an alarm, and curled up on the couch with a book. The house was eerily quiet, but she shrugged it off. It was just an old house. Old houses made noises. The second night, she started hearing things. At first, it was faint, a light scratching noise. She assumed it was mice. Old houses had those too. But as the night dragged on, the sound became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't coming from the floorboards or the ceiling. It was coming from inside the walls. Samantha set her book down, listening. The scratching moved, a slow, dragging sound like fingernails scraping along wood. It traveled behind her, shifting from one side of the room to the other. She swallowed hard. telling herself it was just an overactive imagination. Then she heard a whisper. Not words, not even a voice, just a soft, breathy exhale. She stood abruptly, her pulse hammering. The whisper had come from the vent near the fireplace. Samantha grabbed her phone and opened the security app. The front and back doors were locked. No signs of movement outside. She forced a nervous laugh. Get a grip, Sam. She tried to shake it off, but as she headed upstairs to the guest bedroom, she felt it. An unnatural stillness. The kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise. Something was wrong with this house. By the third night, the noises were no longer subtle. She woke to a thud, then another. It came from the walls, a slow, rhythmic knocking. Samantha sat up, heart pounding. The room was bathed in darkness, but her eyes adjusted enough to make out the door. The knocking continued. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It traveled, moving along the walls, as if something was crawling inside them. She turned on her phone's flashlight, gripping it like a weapon. Hello? The knocking stopped. Then, a single deafening bang from inside the closet. Samantha shot out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a lamp, as she approached the closet door. She hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she yanked it open. Nothing, just empty space. Clothes, shoes, darkness. But as she turned away, something shifted in the vent near the floor. She froze. The metal grate was slightly ajar. A shadow moved inside. Samantha staggered back, her breath shallow. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture before she could think. The flash illuminated the vent for a split second, just long enough for her to see a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring back at her. She screamed. The vent slammed shut. Samantha ran. She bolted down the stairs, grabbed her keys, and fumbled with the front door lock. Her shaking hands made it impossible to turn the key fast enough. Behind her, something skittered through the walls, fast, frantic, hungry. She finally wrenched the door open and stumbled outside. She didn't stop running until she was inside her car, gasping for breath. The next morning, she returned with the police. They searched the house but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone living inside the walls. But Samantha knew what she saw. And when she checked her phone later that day, her stomach turned to ice. The photo she had taken of the vent, there was a face in the darkness, thin, pale, wide, unblinking eyes, and a grin stretched too wide to be human. The pay was too good to pass up. Evan had been struggling to make ends meet, and when his aunt asked him to house sit for a few nights, he jumped at the opportunity. Her place was a little old, a Victorian-style house that had been in the family for decades. She assured him it was an easy job. Just water the plants, bring in the mail, and make sure the house didn't burn down. Simple. The first night was uneventful. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creaks of the wooden floors settling. Evan kept the TV on for background noise, scrolling through his phone, ignoring the strange way the house seemed to breathe around him. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. It began with the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Evan sat up from the couch, his eyes flicking toward the front door. He hadn't heard anyone approach. The motion-activated porch light hadn't turned on. He waited, heart pounding. Knock, knock, knock. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. A cold dread curled in his stomach as he stood. The knocking repeated, this time from upstairs. He swallowed hard and grabbed a flashlight. His aunt hadn't mentioned anything about weird noises, but old houses made sounds, right? That's all this was. Just the house settling. He crept up the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. As he reached the landing, a chill ran down his spine. The knocking had stopped. The hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. Then he saw it. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. His aunt had never mentioned an attic. A slow, sinking dread settled in his chest. The space beyond the door was pitch black, but something about the darkness felt unnatural, deeper, hungry. A sharp creak made his breath hitch. Something moved up there. Evan took a step back. He wasn't about to check the attic. Nope, absolutely not. He turned, heading back downstairs. He could deal with this in the morning. But as he reached the last step, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. Footsteps, not behind him, not above him, in the walls. A slow, shuffling movement, pressing against the wood, dragging, scratching. His breath came out in shallow gasps. Then a whisper. Not words, just a sound. A breathy, rasping laugh. Evan bolted. He ran straight for the front door, fumbling with the locks, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the keys. His pulse pounded in his ears. Just as he yanked the door open, something slammed against the wall behind him. A single, distorted whisper slithered into his, "Don't go." He didn't look back. He didn't stop running. The next morning, Evan called his aunt, his voice shaking as he asked about the attic. She was silent for a long time. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "We don't have an attic." The money was good, too good. But Michelle didn't question it. She needed the cash, and house sitting for a few nights in a quiet suburban neighborhood seemed like easy work. The owners, a middle-aged couple, were leaving for a last-minute trip and just needed someone to watch the house, feed their cat, and make sure everything stayed in order. Simple. The first night was quiet. The house had a strange, stale smell, like old books and something metallic, but Michelle ignored it. She fed the cat, locked the doors, and settled on the couch to watch TV. Around midnight, the cat, an old tabby named Pumpkin, started acting strange. He sat in the hallway, staring at the basement door, his tail flicking aggressively. His ears were pinned back, his body low to the ground. Michelle frowned. "What's wrong, buddy?" Pumpkin didn't move. Then she heard it. A noise, software, faint, coming from the basement. A slow, rhythmic tapping. Her stomach twisted. The couple hadn't said anything about anyone else being in the house, and they hadn't mentioned a basement. She hesitated, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded wrong, like it was coming from deep underground. Slow, deliberate. Michelle grabbed her phone and checked the security system. The doors and windows were locked. The motion sensor showed nothing unusual. Pumpkin let out a low, guttural growl. The tapping stopped. She held her breath. Silence pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. She exhaled shakily and shook her head. Maybe it was the pipes, or an animal outside. She turned off the TV and went upstairs to sleep. At 3:12 a.m., she woke up. Not to a sound, not to movement, to a feeling. Something was wrong. The air in the room was different, heavy, still. She felt it before she even opened her eyes. That sensation of being watched, of something unseen, lingering too close. Then, she heard it. A whisper, not from the hallway, not from the basement or the bed. Her heart slammed against her rib. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The whisper was faint, almost like it was coming from the floorboards beneath her. Then, a slow, dragging. Michelle squeezed her eyes shut. Something was crawling out. She could hear it. The shift of weight, the creak of the wooden floor, something too light to be human, dragged itself forward. Her phone was on the nightstand. She forced herself to move, slowly, carefully. She reached out, fingers brushing against the screen. The bed creaked. The whispering stopped. The air grew unbearably cold. Then, a hand, a cold, skeletal hand shot out from under the bed and grabbed her wrist. Michelle screamed. She threw herself back, kicking wildly as she scrambled off the bed. Her phone clattered to the floor. She didn't dare look down. She bolted for the door, yanking it open. As she fled down the hallway, she heard it crawl after her, a sickening, wet scraping against the floor. Not fast, not hurried, just a patient, deliberate pursuit. She made it down the stairs, her breath ragged, her vision blurring from terror. She reached for the front door. It was unlocked. She hadn't left it unlocked. Something had been in the house before she even arrived. She wrenched it open and ran into the night, not stopping until she reached her car. The next morning, she called the homeowners, trying to keep her voice steady. She asked about the basement, asked if anyone else had a key. A long silence. Then, in a quiet voice, the wife said, "We don't have a basement." I should have said no. The job felt off from the start, but the money was too good to pass up. House sitting for a weekend? Easy. No pets, no complicated rules. Just make sure the house stayed locked and don't go into the master bedroom. That last rule should have been a red flag. The house was old, sitting at the end of a long, desolate street with no neighbors close by. The air inside felt stale, thick with dust, and the furniture looked untouched, like no one had lived there in years. The first night was uneventful, but something about the house made my skin crawl. The silence was unnatural, too deep, too complete. Even in the dead of night, there were no creaking pipes, no shifting floorboards, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. At 2:47 a.m., I woke up, not because of a noise, because of a presence. I lay frozen in bed, my pulse hammering. I could feel something watching me. Then, the air shifted. A slow, deliberate footstep sounded from the hallway. I held my breath. Another step, closer, then another. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and turned on the flashlight. The second the light hit the doorway, the footsteps stopped. I forced myself to get up, to check. The hallway was empty, but as I scanned the walls, my stomach turned to ice. The door to the master bedroom was open. I knew I hadn't touched it. My skin crawled. The inside of the room was pitch black. I couldn't see anything beyond the doorway. The darkness felt wrong, deeper than it should be, as if it were swallowing all light. Then I saw it. A figure standing just inside the room, motionless, watching. It was impossibly tall, its head nearly touching the ceiling, its limbs too long, too thin, its eyes wide black pits locked onto mine. A slow, rasping breath echoed from the room. Then it moved, not stepped, glided straight toward me. I slammed the door and ran. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about being polite. I grabbed my keys, yanked open the front door, and bolted to my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The next morning, I called the homeowner. A woman answered. When I told her what happened, there was a long silence. Then she sighed. That's why we don't sleep there anymore. The house was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing I noticed when I arrived. It was an easy job, house sitting for an elderly couple while they visited their daughter. They were kind, but something about them felt off. The old man hesitated before handing me the keys, his gaze lingering on the house like he didn't want to leave. His wife, a frail woman with hollow eyes, squeezed my hand before they left and whispered, "Don't listen to it." I didn't ask what she meant. I should have. The first few hours were normal. I explored the house, checking the locks, familiarizing myself with the rooms. Everything felt untouched, like the house was frozen in time. The air was stale, the walls lined with old photographs, black and white, the kind where the people never smile. Night came fast. By midnight, the silence had grown unbearable. No creaking floors, no humming appliance, just nothing. Even my breathing felt too loud. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., I heard it. A voice. Help me. Faint, weak, coming from inside the house. I sat up in bed, my stomach twisting. I told myself I imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks. Then, again, help me. This time it was closer. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly stepped into the hallway. The voice was coming from downstairs, the basement. I didn't know the house had a basement. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed in bed. But my body moved on its own, drawn forward like I wasn't in control anymore. I reached the basement door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, only darkness. Please, a child's voice, fragile, desperate. My throat tightened. My mind screamed at me to run. But my hand moved against my will, pushing the door open further. A damp, musty smell hit. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, revealing crumbling stone steps that led deep underground. I took a step forward. Then, a hand grabbed my ankle. I screamed, stumbling backward, the flashlight flickering wildly. I kicked, scrambling away as something thin and pale retreated into the shadows beneath the stairs. The voice changed. Stay. No longer a child. Something wrong. The shadows shifted. Something moved toward me, fast, crawling, dragging, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. I slammed the door and bolted upstairs. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, keys shaking in my hands. I never went back. The next day, I got a call from the couple. The old woman's voice was quiet, almost sad. "You opened the door, didn't you?" I couldn't answer, she sighed. "It'll follow you now." The house was gorgeous, a sprawling old mansion hidden in the hills. The owners, a well-to-do couple, had asked me to house sit while they went on vacation. The pay was great, and they reassured me that it was just a typical job. Water the plants, take care of the mail, and stay out of the attic. The attic. I had no intention of going up there. There were no warnings or strange looks. It was just a simple rule. But something about it felt off. There was an undercurrent of unease in the air, a tension I couldn't shake. The first night went smoothly enough. The house creaked and groaned with the wind, but that was to be expected. I followed the rules, locked doors, watered plants, kept to myself. It wasn't until the second night that things took a darker turn. I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I heard it. A soft, muffled noise. It came from the attic. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling, but the sound repeated, louder, more insistent. A scraping, like something dragging across the floor. Then a slow, rhythmic thump. I stood, heart pounding, and walked toward the stairs. The sound was coming from directly above me. The attic door, which I had made sure was locked, stood at the top of the landing. Thump, thump, thump. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was up there. I hesitated. The couple had been clear, stay out of the attic. But the curiosity gnawed at me. What if there was something up there? Maybe an animal had gotten it, or the wind had knocked something loose. I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and climbed the stairs. The hallway was thick with shadows, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above the attic door. The door itself was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The attic was pitch black, the air stale and heavy. The beam of my flashlight flickered, illuminating the dust-covered floor and forgotten furniture. There were old trunks stacked in the corner, a rickety rocking chair, and a large mirror that reflected nothing but darkness. I stepped in. The air was so thick, it felt like it was pressing against me, and then I heard it again. A whisper, low, faint, almost inaudible. "Get out." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was raspy, distorted, like it came from deep within the walls. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight around the room. The whispering stopped, but the attic felt different now, suffocating, alive. The mirror reflected no one, no movement, no shadows, just my own trembling figure, standing there. Then something moved. From the corner of the room, a shadow darted across the floor. It was fast, too fast to be natural. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. I stumbled back, but before I could turn to run, the attic door slammed shut. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick, oppressive, and the whispering began again, louder this. You shouldn't have come up here. Panic surged through me. I scrambled toward the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into soft laughter, low, mocking, cruel, and then in the darkness, I saw something. A pair of glowing eyes just inches from my face. I don't remember how I got out of there. All I know is that when I finally made it back downstairs, the house was completely still. I could still hear the laughter in my mind, still feel the weight of those eyes watching. I left the house the next morning, refusing to go back. The owners returned a week later. When I told them what happened, the husband just nodded, as though he'd been expecting it. You didn't listen, did you? I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't need to. The attic had always been locked for a reason. It was supposed to be an easy gig, house sitting for a weekend while the owners were away. They had a gorgeous modern home. Nothing too big, nothing too small. Just the kind of house that screamed luxury without being ostentatious. I'd been recommended by a friend, and the couple seemed friendly enough. They gave me a quick tour of the house, showed me the guest room where I'd be staying, and handed me the keys with a smile. Everything's pretty straightforward, the wife said, her voice smooth. Just keep the place in good condition and stay out of the garden shed in the backyard. I nodded, a little confused. Why would they want me to avoid the shed? They didn't elaborate, but I didn't think too much of it. People had their quirks, after all. The first night was fine. I settled into the guest room, spent some time watching TV, and checked in on the house's security system. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Around 2:30 a.m., I was awoken by a strange noise coming from outside my window, a scraping sound. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a tree branch brushing against the glass or maybe an animal. But then the sound came again, louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to calm myself. It's nothing, I muttered, shaking my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noise wasn't coming from the trees. It was closer. In fact, it was coming from the shed in the backyard. Something or someone was scraping against the shed's metal walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind. It was probably some old rusted part of the shed falling against the metal in the breeze. But my mind kept racing. I had already been told to stay away from the shed. I couldn't resist. My feet were moving before I even realized it, carrying me downstairs and out into the backyard. The cold night air hit me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I stepped closer to the shed, the scraping growing louder as I approached. My flashlight flickered as I shone it on the building, and for a moment, the light didn't reveal anything, just a dark, empty structure with the faintest outline of rusted tools leaning against the walls. Then, the flashlight beam landed on something in the corner, something that wasn't supposed to be there, a figure, a hunched shape, standing perfectly still, facing the back wall. Its arms were long, too long, and its skin was a sickly, unnatural pale white. I froze. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then the figure moved. It jerked its head around, too fast, the movement sending a shock of terror through my body. Its eyes were black, empty pits, no pupils, no whites, just a deep void that seemed to swallow the light. I staggered back, stumbling into the metal fence. It made a loud clang, and the figure's head snapped in my direction. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat. Then it spoke. You shouldn't have come. The voice was wrong, too low, too distorted, like it was coming from within the shed itself. I turned and ran. My breath was coming in shallow gasps as I raced back to the house. I could hear it behind me, scraping, dragging, the sound getting closer, faster. It wasn't human. Whatever it was, it moved with a terrifying speed and precision. I reached the front door, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I slammed it shut as soon as I was inside and locked every deadbolt. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, too terrified to sleep. I kept my eyes on the windows, half expecting to see the figure outside, watching. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. At dawn, I called the homeowners, my voice shaking as I explained everything that had happened. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then the wife spoke, her voice eerily calm. Did you go near the shed? I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't lie. I didn't listen. I went out there. Another pause. That's what happens. People always go to the shed. We warned you. My heart sank. You'll never be able to leave. The line went dead. I've never gone back. I don't know what was in that shed, but I do know this. I should have listened. It started with a simple phone call, the kind of call I didn't expect, but should have. A woman's voice, smooth and calm, explaining that I had been recommended for a house-sitting job. They needed someone to watch their home while they took a short vacation. The pay was decent, and they said there were no special instructions other than one. Do not enter the guest bedroom. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded more details, but I didn't. I was just happy for the work. When I arrived at the house, I was impressed. It was an older, two-story home with ivy crawling up the side and a large, almost eerie garden in the backyard. Everything seemed well kept, like the owners were meticulous, but something about the house felt off. It wasn't in a bad neighborhood, but the quiet was unnatural. Not a single sound, not even from the street. The couple, an older man and woman, greeted me warmly. They showed me around, explained the security system, and gave me the key. The husband gave me a peculiar look when he told me not to enter the guest bedroom. He didn't explain why, just insisted that I stay out of it. Everything else is yours to use, the wife added, smiling softly. But not that room. I nodded, trying to brush off the strange request. The first night was uneventful. The house creaked with age, and the wind howled outside, but it was peaceful. I locked up for the night, double-checked the windows, and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I was awoken by the sound of something scratching. It was soft at first, almost like a mouse in the walls, but then it grew louder. The sound seemed to come from upstairs. I lay there, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then it happened again, closer this time, as though whatever was causing the sound was moving down the hall. The scratching became rhythmic, almost deliberate. It was followed by a faint thumping. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I had to know what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of the bedroom, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. I tiptoed toward the stairs, trying to remain as quiet as possible. The scratching and thumping were growing louder now. It was coming from inside the guest bedroom. My pulse quickened. I knew I shouldn't open that door, but curiosity got the better of me. The idea of something or someone being inside that room, making that, was unbearable. I reached for the doorknob and paused. For a moment, I thought about turning around, going back to bed, and forgetting all about it. But something urged me on. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open slowly. The moment the door creaked, the noise stopped. The room was dark, pitch black, except for the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. I couldn't see anything in the room, but I could feel it. There was an oppressive heaviness, like something was lurking just beyond my vision. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the room. The walls were covered with old wallpaper, peeling at the edges. The bed was untouched, perfectly made. No one was in sight. But the floor, I nearly stumbled over something small. I bent down and shined the flashlight toward it. It was a scrap of paper, a crumpled note, stained and old. My heart raced as I unfolded it, reading the words written in a messy, frantic hand. "Don't open the door." I froze. The message made no sense. Who had written this? Why was it in here? Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. The darkness around me felt suffocating. I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight scanning the room in a panic. The air seemed to vibrate with something unnatural. I could hear breathing now, deep, raspy breathing, almost like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. I dared not look, but I couldn't stop myself. A figure emerged from the shadows, so pale it seemed to glow in the dim light. It was crouching, hunched over, with long, disjointed limbs and a twisted face. Too many sharp angles, too many eyes. Its gaze fixed on me with predatory intensity. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. It just stood there, watching. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged. I don't remember how I got out of that. All I know is that when I awoke, I was lying in the drenched in sweat. The house was still, quiet once more. The door to the guest room was shut tight. I left the house that morning. I never returned. The homeowners called me later, concerned that I hadn't finished the job. I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. I could barely speak, my mind reeling from what had happened. They didn't seem surprised. "It always happens like," the wife said, her voice flat. "You opened the door, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, but I should have listened. I should have stayed away from that. I've always found house sitting to be a good way to make a little extra money. The rules were usually simple. Keep things tidy, water the plants, collect the mail, and avoid the areas the owners didn't want you to go. And so, when the opportunity to sit for the Andersons came up, I was eager to take the job. They were a middle-aged couple, friendly enough, and they lived in a large home on the outskirts of town. The house was charming, older, with lots of character. As they showed me around, the husband, Mark, gave me the usual instruction. Make sure the house stays in one piece, and for the love of God, don't go into the basement. Why? I asked, a little curious. Mark's eyes briefly darted toward his wife, then back to me. It's just not a place you need to be. It's unfinished, you know? He chuckled, though the laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. Don't worry about it. Just leave it alone and we'll be back in a week. I didn't think much of it. Most people had their quirks, right? They paid me, I stayed in their house. I left it in one piece. Easy money. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time watching TV, making the occasional trip to the store, and keeping the house in order. But then, on the fourth night, it happened. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard something. A soft thud from the basement. I froze. I knew I shouldn't go down there. But something about the sound was so wrong. Like something had fallen over, or worse, something was moving around. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the thud came again, followed by the faintest scraping. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else trying to find its way into the basement. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Against my better judgment, I stood up. Slowly, I made my way to the basement door. The house was eerily silent. The scraping sound had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick, palpable. I reached for the door handle and hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, I opened it. The basement was dark. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, and the air that hit me was damp, musty. I flicked on the light, and the weak bulb sputtered before illuminating the dark, cluttered space. Old furniture, boxes covered in dust, and tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in years filled the room. Nothing unusual. But then I saw it. In the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, was a large, old-fashioned mirror. I had no memory of seeing it when I first toured the basement. It was odd. Its frame was tarnished and covered in dust, but it gleamed under the flickering light. Something about it felt out of place, almost inviting. I approached it cautiously, unable to tear my eyes away. The reflection in the mirror didn't match the room I was standing in. In the reflection, I saw the basement as it should have been. Cluttered, dark, but there was someone else there. A figure. A man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit standing in the corner. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and piercing. I stepped back, my heart racing, and the figure in the mirror. It wasn't a mirror, I realized. It was a portal. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I turned to run, but before I could, the air in the basement grew heavy. Too heavy to breathe. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. I turned back to the mirror, and now, the man was right there, standing in front of it. His eyes were glowing, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. You shouldn't have come down here. His voice was low, guttural, and echoed in my mind. I screamed, stumbling backward, and without thinking, I bolted for the door. But the door wouldn't open. The handle turned, but it felt like something was pulling it shut, trapping me inside. The man in the mirror was still there, his grin widening. I frantically pushed against the door, but it was useless. The basement light flickered and then went out completely, leaving me in darkness. I could feel him behind me, could feel his presence drawing closer. His breath was cold on my neck, his voice hissing in my ear. You shouldn't have come down here. The door finally flew open. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything else but getting the hell out of that basement. I ran out of the house, shaking, terrified. I never returned. The owners came back the next week, and when I went to return the key, they seemed different. The wife, in particular, looked at me with something like recognition in her eyes. You went into the basement, didn't you? She asked. I couldn't speak. I just handed over the keys and walked away. I don't know what I saw down there. I don't know what that man was or why he was trapped in that mirror, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to find out. And now, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear his voice. You shouldn't have come down here.